My name is Volker Wieland. I'm Managing Director of the IMFS. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's IMFS Working Lunch. And as I said, we shouldn't let the sandwiches go to waste. And thank you. So you brought it in. That's exactly how we should do this. Also, with the working lunches, we basically stick on time. So we 12 to 1, so people can count on going back to work or I mean, this is part of work in a sense, going back to work afterwards. So I'm delighted to welcome you all. It's good to see you. Many of you I know very well. It's great to have people from the central banking world, from the financial community, the ECB, the faculty, students on this occasion. And of course, it's great to have my dear friend Athanasios Orphanides back in town. We thought it's been ages. We actually, he said I should mention that he learned everything he knows about, almost everything he knows about central banking at the Federal Reserve Board and at the Division of Monetary Affairs. And he stayed there quite a while until 2007. And I forgot, you went there in 90, well,
time ago.
Anyway, you were there a little bit before me, and I learned a lot from you. Because then I came as a fresh PhD economist in 95 on the job market. So several of the students here are on the job market, the academic job market, professional job market right now. So I was very happy. The very first time I met Athanasios, because I think this was when the Division of Monetary Affairs was interviewing me, and I thought, well, that's finally somebody who seems to be interested and seems to want me. Now I just have to perform well so they actually make an offer. And so finally they did make an offer. So I was very happy to overlap there with you. But you went on to bigger and more important things from 2007 to 2012. You were governor of the Central Bank of Cyprus and a member of the Governing Council of the European Central Bank. And 2007 to 2012 sounds like a long time ago, but actually we are still working out some of the things which happened back then, right? So you had the financial crisis in that period. So this was, of course, a fascinating and very challenging period. And Athanasios has a lot of stories to tell about that period, but that won't be the topic of today's talk. Since then, he's been teaching at MIT Business School. He actually also holds a PhD from MIT, so it was kind of a coming home, I guess. At least you're still doing that and seem to enjoy that very much. And it's great that after Corona, I remember the ECB Watchers. During Corona, we had the strategy review, and we did an ECB Watchers online. And so the last time you were here was only online in that conference. And we just talked about it. Personally, you have your own views. Maybe they're not very close, but personally, I'm just saying it for me personally. I think that some of the contributions in our conference, which was also about what strategy the ECB should follow and what strategy review elements are key, some of those aged better than the actual result of the strategy review. But more on that maybe during your talk. I don't know. So I'll hand over to you. Thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you, Volker, for this warm introduction. I have to say it was a great hire when we managed to convince you to join us at the Board of Governors, but then somehow we lost you and you ended up in this city, this very nice city. I enjoyed visiting this city. I used to have to visit it too much for a number of years, but it's a lovely place. I always enjoy returning to it. So I appreciate the invitation to address this audience. Haven't been in this building in a few years since another conference I was here. And I thought that when I was on the Governing Council of the ECB, we had some issues. I left, my last Governing Council meeting was in April of 2012. 2-3 years before that, we had some issues. But then when I look at what has been happening since then, well, actually, yeah, it's the fulfillment of the primary mandate of the ECB was quite good at that time. And one of the remarkable things, if you look at the inflation performance of a number of central banks around the world, is that things were quite good. I recall the Fed was complaining because their inflation performance was a couple of tenths, like 0.2 below their 2% objective. But if you just compare the performance over in this century until what happened after the pandemic, the outcomes were reasonably good. We could have been worried. We could have been worried about inflation being somewhat too low. I recall I wished that the ECB was more expansionary for a few years before the pandemic. Still, we have a problem in the last few years. And what I'd like to do in this, in the next about 20-25 minutes, is really try to understand how we ended up with this post-pandemic inflation problem. As a student of monetary policy, I always believed, this goes back to being a student of Rudin Dornbusch and Stan Fischer. You have to study history, and one of the benefits of studying history is that you can draw lessons and then improve your strategy going forward. So what I will try to do is give you a story of my understanding of how we ended up with the policy mistake that we have seen in the post-pandemic inflation. And I need to go a little bit earlier for that. I'm going to start by saying that watching monetary policy around the world during 2020, during the pandemic, I was relieved that central banks did what I thought was a very good job. Unlike some earlier episodes, central banks were decisive in being expansionary. Their actions helped governments be able to apply effectively fiscal policy tools as well. And together, this combination of policies protected our economies in pretty much all advanced countries from the horrible outcomes that we could have had if we did not have this reaction. It was bad enough that we had a health crisis that we needed to deal with. It would have been an unnecessary extra burden if we did not have the decisive policy response that at least alleviated some of the economic catastrophe that could have occurred. Now, this was 2020, and in 2021, we could already see that the post-pandemic recovery was quite strong, unexpectedly strong. And in addition to that, we experienced globally a number of supply constraints that created spikes in inflation and in some prices. Now, this is an environment where I would say, in my experience in central banking, that's fine. You observe what the shocks are, and then you're supposed to apply a reasonable strategy, respond to that, start normalizing policy, deal with it. And instead, what we saw is that in many, not all, but in many central banks in advanced economies, we saw I'm going to call it surprising delay in beginning to normalize policy, even though all of the projections we would have available, all of the sentiment in markets were suggesting that the economy was at risk of having high inflation for a while. Central banks were too late to adjust their policy, and they fell behind the curve. So what I want to do is understand why we observed this error. What can we trace it to? I will look at three central banks: the Bank of Japan, the ECB, and the Fed. These are the G3 central banks. I will show you just in a couple of minutes that the Bank of Japan did not have a problem. It was actually correct in continuing to accommodate policy all the way through last year. Bank of Japan was facing pressure last year after everybody else started tightening that they should as well. No, they should not have. They were correct in that. And then focus on the Fed and the ECB and try to identify the specific decisions that were taken based on public information to see what went wrong. So the way I can describe this in summary, and this is in the title of the paper. The Fed and the ECB, and they were not alone, some other central banks did the same thing. They fell into the following trap. They wanted to communicate information about future interest rates in order to enhance the effectiveness of policy. There is nothing wrong with being clear about what your policy is, but instead of communicating a policy rule, they opted to communicate explicit information about interest rates that was consistent with the baseline scenario of the economy and not really contingent, as a policy rule should have been, on the evolution of the economy. So in that sense, they got trapped by their own communication, and then they had a pretty hard time getting out of that. In the end, they did not get out of it early enough, and we ended up with too high inflation. So this is why I call this episode the forward guidance trap. Now I need to remind you of policy. Very, very impressive easing. And again, I know not everybody agrees with me on this one, but if you look here, you can see that for the Bank of Japan and the ECB, interest rate policy was already exhausted. There was nothing these two central banks could have done. The Fed very quickly came back to zero. All of the central banks needed to rely on balance sheet expansion because they were stuck at the effective lower bound. And I think this was appropriate. This was really immense. It's kind of, for the Fed, you had an expansion of the balance sheet in 3 months that was more than the expansion of the Fed balance sheet in the first 100 years of the Fed, just to put it in perspective, okay? And I think it was the correct response, no problem with that. The issue is, once you have an expansionary policy like this, you need to have a plan for how to normalize, for how to remove it as the economy improves. And this we did not see. Now, how can we tell that? Since monetary policy has to be forward-looking in light of the transmission lags of policy, it's not enough to look at actual inflation, which is what I already showed you. It's actually more informative for evaluating monetary policy to look at the outlook for inflation, as this is reflected in forecasts, survey expectations, financial markets, and make sure that policy is appropriately adjusting as the evolution of inflation and real economic activity changes. Now, for my purposes here, it's sufficient to just look at the evolution of inflation. This is really the main element that was missed, and it's sufficient to look at financial markets. We have daily readings of inflation expectations with some premium associated to that in the inflation swap markets. And what I show you in this chart is 1 year inflation expectations implied in inflation swap markets, 2 year and 5 year. And from this you can see that, sure, we had the inflation rise quite rapidly, the short-term outlook for inflation rising quite rapidly during 2021. Indeed, for the Fed, it started even earlier. Very important for you to realize this is a story about 2021. We don't even need to go to 2022 when in Europe we have a very dramatic event that actually complicated the situation much more once the war started. And this was very, very important for the ECB as well. But already before we get to that point, you can see that the short-term inflation expectations were rising. Now, this is short-term. If this is just a temporary shock that will dissipate, then we do not want policy to be overly responsive to this. We also want to see what is happening further down. So I prefer to focus as a summary statistic on the 2-year ahead inflation expectations. If we just have a spike and things normalize, the 2-year ahead expectations should reflect this. And you can see that 2-year ahead inflation expectations were actually rising quite a bit for the Fed and the ECB. You can also see already here why the Bank of Japan did not face the same problem. If you look at the 2-year ahead inflation expectations for the Bank of Japan, they were actually throughout, all the way through the end of 2022, they were not even close to 2%. Why 2%? 2% is the common inflation objective for all of these 3 central banks right now. Interesting to check the 5-year swap. This gives you a little bit of information about the credibility of the target of the central bank, the 2%, and the information about how able the central banks would be able to achieve that target. You can see the challenge the Bank of Japan has been facing here, being stuck at the effective lower bound. Expectations have been extremely low for a long time. They only managed to bring the 5-year ahead expectations to 1%. But you can also see from this is before the pandemic, 2019. You can see that already in 2021, 5-year inflation expectations are actually higher than what they were before the pandemic. So if you just do a ballpark analysis of what should the stance of monetary policy be, it should not be exceptionally expansionary relative to what it was before the pandemic by that point in time. Now, of course, these are inflation expectations, not enough to do the analysis. What we want to do is examine how do we understand how central banks fell behind the curve. What we want to do is study the evolution of policy. And what I'm going to do next is just focus on the Fed and the ECB, study the overnight index swap rates, which are a summary of policy decisions and the communication about expected policy decisions over the next couple of years. And then importantly, since it's not nominal interest rates that matter for the economy, we would want to combine the information we have about inflation expectations and interest rate expectations and assess the evolution of ex-ante real interest rates. And this is what is going to inform us about whether policy was properly calibrated or not. So let me just show you a couple of pictures. This is a figure that summarizes Fed and ECB policy. It shows the overnight interest rate in orange. You can see the steps for both central banks. I just mark the date of the liftoff. I'm going to discuss this later on to understand what happened before. I want you to see that before liftoff, policy not only was stuck very low, but if you check the 1-year and 2-year overnight index swaps for interest rate swaps, you're going to see that the communication of policy was suggesting that policy would remain very, very close to the overnight rate, almost to the end of 2022 for the Fed, and actually end of 21 for the Fed, and actually beginning 2022 for the ECB. It's not as if there was a communication that policy should be expected to adjust a year later, as inflation expectations would have suggested. But again, the key thing is real interest rates, and we have enough information here. I'm showing you 1- and 2-year ahead inflation expectations. I'm showing you interest rates at the 1- and 2-year horizon. So all we need to do is combine the two and compute ex-ante real interest rates at the pertinent horizons. And this is where you see, you can start seeing what the problem was. So if you check policy of the Fed, you can see that the Federal Reserve eased successfully real interest rates, and I would say it's entirely appropriate what you have during 2020. You bring the interest rate to -2%, but then as the economy recovers and inflation expectations pick up, what should you do? Should you keep reducing the real interest rate in that instance? The answer, of course, is no. We have no model of the economy whereas inflation picks up and you can see that it will exceed your inflation objective. You should continue to ease policy and you should continue to be driving real interest rates down. And unfortunately, that's what you see. You actually see that during 2021, the real interest rates actually keep falling to levels that actually have not fallen. In the case of the Fed, you're not going to find as negative real interest rates at the 2-year horizon since we have data on OIS and inflation swaps. It goes back beginning of the century pretty much. And for the ECB, yes, this was very similar during 2021. And of course, once the war starts in 2022, where we have the additional shock on inflation, what is the ordinary thing that a central bank should do if it wants to maintain the same degree of accommodation? Just raise interest rates to make up for the pickup in inflation. That's not a tightening of policy. This is just adjusting for the inflation shock to keep real interest rates at a reasonable level, let's say -2%, -3%. Instead, what we see in the case of the ECB, stuck with the forward guidance that would be followed at extremely low levels, negative interest rates. And of course, what that meant was that real interest rate kept falling while inflation was rising. So it's a pretty fundamental policy mistake that was surprising for me to see that a number of central banks, I'm showing you two here, but a number of central banks behaved in this fashion, and this is why it's important to analyze what the causes of that was. What was the strategy element that led to this? How potentially could central banks have been misled by people in academia, like Volcker and I always should be blamed for not informing central banks not to make mistakes like that. Isn't that right, Volcker?
I tried.
See, that's exactly the point. That's my point. So, so I keep repeating, keep blaming us. The important thing is, can we actually make sure we explain what the problem was so that it's not repeated, at least in the future. So since you've seen this one, what I want to do next is go blow by blow in a few minutes and show you what the crucial decisions were that led to the problem. How did the Fed fall into the trap? Well, this is a picture that simply has the 2-year inflation expectation, the overnight policy rate, and the implicit 2-year real interest rate. Why do I focus on this picture? This is daily data. Because this shows very clearly the pattern we should not have seen. You should not be having a situation where as the outlook for inflation exceeds the inflation objective of the central bank and keeps rising, the central bank somehow keeps reducing the real interest rate. This is how simple this thing is. So why did they do this? And why did they do this and have to wait all the way, in the case of the Federal Reserve, until March of 2022 before they started normalizing policy? And of course, we know once at the Fed they realized that they were behind the curve and they need to start normalizing monetary policy. They had to do this very quickly. So we see 75 basis points move, repeated moves like that, which in my career of the Fed, I recall there was one 75 basis points move in 1994. This is 3 of them here, one after the other. And I'm glad they did it. They had to do this to actually minimize the damage that had already been done. And sure, this has some side effects. Some banks may go under as a result of these policies, but if you make mistakes, there are some consequences. It's all about a matter of understanding how to minimize those consequences once you are there. So how did the Fed fall into the trap? We can identify 2 elements. One element that I consider the most important in terms of fundamental concepts in economics is that the Fed decided to move from a forecast-based, forward-looking approach to monetary policy to an outcome-based, myopic approach to monetary policy right in the middle of the pandemic. Now, I don't know what students at GEDA learn when they get monetary economics, but my education on monetary economics is that you should be forward-looking. You should be anticipating what is happening if you want to calibrate policy correctly. And this is how the Fed was operating pretty much all the time I was at the Fed. So I was quite surprised to see why would they do this and what is the likely mistake that would come from that. This is one element. The other element that actually complicated policy quite a bit is the interaction of balance sheet policy and interest rate policy. In the case of the Fed provided an implicit commitment, implicit, not explicit, to only reduce its net asset purchases very gradually and only start lifting interest rates after that process ended. Now, the concern about doing this very gradually implied a long lag in raising interest rates after the recognition that interest rates should have been adjusted. Now, in their case, in the Fed's case, this was implicit, but that decision was made, and they actually implemented that. I can show you with specific decisions how we can identify the error. So this is the comparison that shows us exactly when the Fed decided to become myopic. This is the information about policy provided at the July 29, 2020 meeting. Up to that point, the Fed was forward-looking. They were saying they would keep interest rates at zero as long as the economy is on track to achieve its objectives. That's on track to achieve. This is a forward-looking orientation to policy. And you will see that at the next meeting, September 16th, they became myopic. The language changed to maintain interest rates at zero until labor market conditions have reached maximum employment. You know you are too late if you are waiting to reach maximum employment before you start lifting policy, as well as inflation has risen to 2%, which is the mandate. So you know, by definition, you will actually overshoot the target. You will be behind the curve. Point is, was this deliberate? It was deliberate. This was reflected. This was an interpretation of the change in the Fed strategy that actually convinced the Fed that it would be okay to overshoot inflation a little bit. Now, when that happened, what that meant was overshoot inflation by a couple of tenths, which is the same in reverse as the undershooting they had had before. So the overshooting of inflation and the strategy change of the Fed was already met by the end of 2020, as a matter of fact, because inflation had already risen. It does not explain why we have this problem that we observed in 2021. So that's not enough. So this is one element. The other element was the I can show you actually. I can show you with two specific additional quotes here how this myopia mattered. So from the minutes of the September meeting, we can see that some members of the FOMC were concerned that becoming myopic was not really such a good idea, and they should have had some opt-out clauses to be able to adjust policy and avoid a mistake. That concern was there. It's not as if not anybody realizes that there is an issue. But then I want you to see how de facto this was interpreted by having a quote from the November 2021. This is already way too late for adjusting policy. This is the chair's press conference after the policy meeting. A reporter asked, have you discussed raising interest rates? And everybody around the world is screaming, you should have raised interest rates by now. What's the answer? The answer is, well, we have not focused on whether we meet the lift-off test because we don't meet the lift-off test now because we are not at maximum employment. Two conditions. By then, the inflation condition was way met. They still have the other condition. No. We really need to have more inflation. We really need to have to reach maximum employment. Only then we will consider that. And of course, this is the form of myopia that predictably will lead to a mistake. The other element was the balance sheet delay. The difficulty at the zero lower bound is that you need to have both balance sheet and interest rate policy. And you can see how there were actually in 2021 concerns, you can read this in the minutes of the FOMC, that the FOMC is saying we need to adjust policy, we need to adjust policy, we need to adjust policy. But they still don't do anything to interest rates. So why not? Why not have an adjustment in interest rates in 2021, even though the record says that the problem was recognized? Because they did not want to raise interest rates before they completed the net asset purchases, and they were only gradually reducing the net asset purchases. So only in January, the committee announced that they decided to stop net asset purchases in early March. And of course, as soon as people saw this, then everybody realized, oh yeah, so this means that at the first FOMC meeting after early March, which was March 16th, you will have a tightening. But you can see how the interaction with the balance sheet caused an additional few months of delay in the process. So this is what you have for the case of the Fed. And then we can actually do similar analysis for the ECB, again, based on the public record. For the ECB, you're going to see that the ECB had a very similar problem as the Fed did, but it was slightly smaller until the end of 21. But it was still a problem. The ECB, by communicating that it would keep interest rates negative for a very, very long time, while inflation expectations were rising, and again, I use the 2-year as a summary of conditions overall, the ECB was deliberately, much like the Fed, reducing the real interest rate further down. And the ECB made an additional mistake. In my view, this is a mistake, that when the energy shock was observed in the spring of 2022, they did not communicate anything on policy, effectively easing the real interest rate at the 2-year horizon to -4. I challenge you to put this in any model that you might think and tell me where this would be consistent with reasonable policy, and not by a mile in my view. And then you can see only in July we have the normalization start, and unlike the Fed, the ECB started normalizing kind of slowly. We did not see the 375 basis points move that we saw in the case of the Fed. So how did the ECB fall into a trap that it's similar to what happened with the Fed, but it's not identical? We can actually again identify two elements in the policy strategy that was being followed. One is very similar, but in the ECB's case, it was explicit. It was a commitment to raising policy rates only after net asset purchases ended. This was implicit for the Fed. This was explicit for the ECB. But then the other one that was really difficult to justify in terms of a reasonable policy advice that we can model is that the ECB adopted an implementation framework for asset purchases, and the ECB is much more complicated. They have two different asset purchases program, and then decided to have an implementation that was calendar-based. So you say, we want to ease policy with asset purchases, and I say, that's great, I want you to do asset purchase. And then sentence number 2, we will be doing this for the next year and a half. And I say, whoa, 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 what do you mean by that? How do you know what's going to happen over the next year and a half? Is this really reasonable? So it was not explicitly myopic as the Fed was, but it was similarly myopic in the sense that if you tie your hands for the next year, things change by the time the year ends, and you are not able to respond. So this is the similarity in the policy, even though the practical decision making was different. So the conditions for raising interest rates, you can actually see a comparison here. It was very explicit for the ECB that net asset purchases would keep going on, and that the interest rate would start rising only after net asset purchases would end. This was explicit in the case of the ECB. How did this affect policy? Well, remember I gave you a quote from Chair Powell in November of 2021 earlier. By the time the Fed should have started easing by then. We actually have something similar almost the same day with President Lagarde, a testimony at the European Parliament. And in her testimony, she's effectively saying, well, despite the current inflation surge, there's no need to adjust policy for the next year. It's very, very similar to what you heard Chair Powell describe, even though there are some differences in the framework. And of course, this could not have possibly been sustainable. Inflation was already rising very rapidly in November 2021. And then once we got the shock in spring of 2022, this was just impossible to keep. So what about the conditions of raising interest rates? Let me not focus on this because I want to save some time for later on. The calendar implementation of policy is what made ECB decisions effectively be myopic at the end of the day. And I want to show you just a couple of examples. So this is December of 2020, which was fine. And look at this language. The ECB decides that it will increase the envelope on one of the purchases program until the end of March 2022. Now, wait a minute. This is 15 months into the future. How can you be committing to be expanding monetary policy for 15 months? How do you know what could happen in the meantime? This is an example of policy that appears to be reasonable on the basis of a baseline scenario that you come up with. And if the baseline scenario materializes, then nobody notices that there is anything wrong with it. But of course, this is not how central banking works. Central banking should always be prepared to adjust policy as the outlook evolves. And a statement like this effectively robbed the Governing Council of the ability to do that adjustment. You can see later on, in December 2021, you can see the discussion on the other purchase program, the APP. This was projected to actually continue for as long as necessary. So this is a pretty open-ended continuing increase at the end of 21, by which time the ECB should have started tightening policy. Then you can see by March, this is after the additional shock we have with energy prices spiking in Europe. At this point, there is a confirmation, of course, that one of the asset purchases programs will stop, but the other purchase program will keep going until the end of June, and then possibly later on in the year, and we'll see. And we are already in a very high inflation environment with the 2-year real interest rate being at -4%, and we have language that for the next quarters we will continue to be expanding policy. So this is effectively what summarizes the error. I will skip over another slide and then tell you how did this end in the case of the ECB. You could see by following the decisions that the ECB Governing Council recognizes they needed to hasten the adjustment, but they were committed to do things until Q3. So what's the resolution of that? Well, in April, you announce that the purchases will be concluded in Q3. Now, Q3 is July, right? In August and September, okay. And then what do you do in June? You end on the 1st of July. So of course this is Q3, so this is fine. This is fine. You're doing this in Q3, exactly as you said. Which of course, much like in the case of the Fed, once they announced this, you knew that interest rates would rise at the next meeting. So this is a summary. You can actually see by examining the decisions of the committees what happened. And I think we want to draw some lessons from that. You know, what do we learn from this? What was the error? And how could this be corrected going forward? Well, the error is that at the zero lower bound, at the effective lower bound, policymakers realize that their monetary policy can become more effective if they can convince the public and investors that they will keep monetary policy accommodative as needed to avert deflation. That's fine. This could be done in different ways. This could be done by having a policy rule that says, as long as inflation is falling, we will keep easing. And once inflation starts rising, then we will normalize. But that would be too rule-like. And in my experience of many central banks around the world, many central banks prefer to remain discretionary. There is an aversion to being systematic, as our theory and experience of best practices suggest. And as a result, what we saw instead in this episode is the adoption of the so-called forward guidance on interest rates, that is explicit guidance on interest rates that's reasonable based on your baseline scenario, but it's total nonsense if any shocks move the economy in a direction that's not consistent with your baseline scenario. And unfortunately, even though this is a known problem, this is something that was not addressed. So what we saw is that the adoption of this strategy effectively, once you had an inflationary shock, by default led to a policy error. It's important to realize the source of the error if we want to avoid repeating these errors in the future. Now, for those of us who remember, because not everybody is teaching these things anymore, for those of us who remember, for example, Milton Friedman's presidential address, 1967, 1968, we could have already seen there are some basic things that you should not be falling for in monetary economics. And let me remind you the two that Milton Friedman had highlighted in his presidential address. One was you cannot peg the rate of unemployment for more than a very limited period. Now, this is the famous Phillips curve, do not exploit the Phillips curve stuff, that I think has pretty much stuck with central bankers. People remember this one. But actually the first one was that you cannot peg interest rates for more than very limited periods. And unfortunately, this did not stick. Unfortunately, too many central banks today communicate monetary policy with a nominal interest rate without really explicitly explaining what that implies for real interest rate, which is what behind Milton Friedman's point at the time was you need to focus your attention on real interest rates, not nominal interest rates. And at the effective lower bound, we saw both the Fed and the ECB adopt a strategy that violated that very principle. They said, no, it's okay, we can peg the nominal interest rate for years, don't worry about it. And of course, we should worry about it. We knew that already from 1968, if not earlier. So this is a fundamental trap that should not have occurred. So I hope that this can improve our understanding of where we go forward. Really what we need to do is ensure that that instead of a strategy framework that is discretionary and tries to communicate future interest rates with so-called forward guidance, instead of that, it's much better for the central bank to explain the policy reaction function, the systematic adjustment of policy to the evolution of the outlook. And in my view, this could be easily done by adopting a simple forecast-based policy rule, forecast over the next few quarters, not longer than that. We cannot forecast longer than that, just to give you guidance about the direction in which you should be going. If you do that, if you do have a systematic description of policy, then people can apply their own projections of inflation and actually get the projections of the nominal interest rate anyway. So the best form of forward guidance is to communicate the policy rule that describes what the central bank is doing. So this is really the basic lesson that I would hope to draw from this. And I could end my talk here with this slide. And I think I will end my talk here with this slide. But in case any of you asks where we are now, I can return to that in one of the questions. I have updated daily data until Friday, before I came to Frankfurt, and I can discuss this in a minute with you in case anybody brings it up. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop here.
Well, thank you very much, Athanasios. That's perfect. We still have time for questions, and probably can also find out about the current situation from you. So, Chiara Zidiodi from the ECB. Thank you.
Thank you. So the legal question first, then you can relax. Now, I'm just curious about the last thing you said, because for a lawyer, forward guidance is not an instrument that is foreseen in the treaty. It appeared at some point. It was one of the creative instruments the Governing Council introduced, yeah, and it was considered very, very positive. Now you are showing all the limitations of our guidance. What you explain is what we need to avoid that it becomes a constraint, because communicating is good, but communicating, committing is bad, right? I would like to know if you are actually advocating deletion of this new instrument from the toolkit, or if it is a variant. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. So again, the way I look at it is that in terms of economic theory and practice, we know that monetary policy works best when, number one, it's systematic, number two, it's forward-looking, so it actually takes into account the lags associated with the transmission of monetary policy. So some guidance in some form is actually an element of good monetary policy. The question is, in what form? Forward guidance by saying, trust me, I will keep interest rates at 0 for the next 2 years, or trust me, I will keep buying bonds for the next year and a half, no matter what. No, there is no reasonable model, and there is no good practice in terms of history that we can identify with this. So I would scrap forward guidance the way it has been implemented. But I would not want to deviate from principles of good policy, which is give me a benchmark so I can see what the outlook for inflation is, I can see what the outlook for the economy is, and try to preempt increases of inflation or decreases of inflation away from my target, and minimize a recession. If I say a recession is coming, I would want to do something to minimize that. So you have to be somewhat forward-looking, but not in the way it was done. Now, my reading of the treaty is not a lawyer's reading of the treaty, but my reading of the treaty is that the ECB Governing Council has far more discretionary authority than any other central bank I've ever seen in any piece of legislation anywhere, and doesn't really say anything about the tools. So the tools are credit operations and open market operations, but the rest is really the description of the communication about how do you communicate how you will be setting interest rate 6 months from now. Well, in my view, the best way to do this is by providing the policy reaction function in some form. I recall some time ago, Volker and I were doing all sorts of work on simple policy rules that could have served as benchmark. In my view, it would be helpful if central banks, including the ECB, not just the ECB though, communicated a simple policy reaction function that can be used by households and investors to assess future behavior. In my view, that is entirely consistent with the treaty. That does not constitute the bad form of forward guidance that we have seen. That would likely improve policy for many reasons, including that it would constrain the discretion that the Governing Council currently has, and which is not really that helpful.
Professor Remsberger?
Yeah, so the best kind of forward guidance would be to follow an interest rate rule. Is that
yes.
your point, your central point? First remark. And second, do you see any tendency of the ECB or the Fed to come back to monetary policy rules or interest rate rules?
Yes.
What I observe at the moment is, as regards to the ECB, is just the contrary. data dependent is the key,
Yeah.
is the key word.
Yes. So let me address this too. So good policy is rules-based policy. I'm going to start from that. Then the first part of your question asks explicitly, does this refer to an interest rate rule? And the way I would approach this is I would say that most of the time, yes, an interest rate rule is sufficient to describe what policy is doing. But that's most of the time, not all of the time. When interest rates are at the effective lower bound, then you need to supplement the interest rate policy rule with a policy rule on the other side of what you can do. I was showing you, for example, the expansion of the balance sheet. Now, if I look at quantitative easing as a form of balance sheet expansion, that can also be rule-like. And we do not have that experience for the case of the ECB. As you know, for the Federal Reserve, the transcripts are actually becoming public with a 5-year lag. So we know that the FOMC in the past has discussed on occasion whether it should make bond purchases more systematic, linked to the outlook for inflation, for example, much like interest rates normally would have been linked to the outlook for inflation. So I believe, yes, mostly interest rate rules, but when needed, we should actually, not only we should go to asset purchases, we want to be preemptive. I recall one of the papers Voltaire and I did when we were at the Fed, we were saying that if you're approaching the zero lower bound, you want to ease more aggressively to avoid it. But then you should always do what you have to do to go back to your 2% inflation objective. We never deviated from that principle, so it's you have to keep things honest in this. So in terms of how central banks behave, let me comment on data independence. So a lot of central banks use the term data independence without saying anything about what that means. And my reading of data independence when the central bank doesn't tell me what that means is actually a move towards even greater discretion, which is exactly inconsistent, exactly the opposite of what good monetary policy is about. Good monetary policy explains how policy will adjust systematically to news. So I would have much preferred, rather than hearing at the press conference, trust me, policy will be data independent. I'm not going to tell you what that is, but it's going to be, trust me, just trust me. I would much prefer a pronouncement that says, look, if the inflation outlook deteriorates, then we will raise interest rate by about this much. If inflation falls, then we will be able to relax what we are doing and maybe even cut interest rates by this much. And trust us, we have read Friedman 1968, so we know the difference between nominal and real interest rates. That would reassure me much more than statements that policy is data independent.
There's a question? Yeah.
Yes, one small question about the forecast-based policy. I want to ask, the problem is we have yet very big inflation because of the thing that the investments in, in buildings and real estates, it was, amazing, about, I think, 10 or 15% in the last 1 year, and maybe 20 and 30% in the last 3 or 4 years. Now, the central bank didn't observe that until this point, the normal inflation as for the normal people was under 2%. But after that, we had shown a very big inflation in the last 5 years, depending on the real estate. Did the central bank put a question, what is happeing if in the future these interest rates will not be possible to be paid from the normal people? You know what I mean?
Oh, I see. You're bringing the financial stability concern that relates to very rapid interest rate rises. This is what I mentioned in passing. One of the costs that we have seen over the past year as a result of the rapid adjustment of nominal interest rates that needed to be done to undo some of the error that we saw in 2021, is that entities, corporations, households, even banks that should have known better, actually ended up being surprised by the deterioration. And yes, we are going to see some financial stability concerns, we're going to see some bankruptcies. Now, in my view, a financial stability objective is very different from a price stability objective. I believe that it's wrong to compromise achievement of the central bank's price stability objective for financial stability considerations, but the central bank should be, of course, aware and try to use other tools as much as possible in order to reduce financial stability risks. That's an issue.
But we're over time, so maybe
sorry.
maybe let's keep it with this, and let's just, because I mean we're over time a little bit, but if you can just say one word on where we stand now, because you kind of advertised it.
Yeah.
So just very briefly, just if you want.
So this would actually continue a partial answer to my question. So I wanted you to see that if we just look at the data as of last Friday, of course we saw that neither the Fed nor the ECB moved at the last meeting. So I want you to see that with the rapid interest rate hikes that the Fed has done, the Fed has brought the ex-ante 2-year real interest rate above 2 percentage points. And this is the inflation swap, 2.5, the ex-ante 2-year real interest rate at 2.5. Based on reasonable estimates we have about what normal for real interest rates is, this actually is sufficiently restrictive so that as long as the Fed continues to maintain this stance, they can be fairly comfortable that inflation will continue to decline. And you can see that they have maintained a 2% real interest rate for a year. In the case of the ECB, this requires some more attention. The ECB, of course, was starting from negative interest rates. Yes, they have raised interest rates quite a bit, but the ex-ante 2-year real interest rate is barely at 1 percentage point. And it's not clear if this is sufficiently restrictive yet. This depends on whether you are very convinced that the natural real rate of interest is around 0. But we don't know that. It could be 1, it could be 1.5. And I would be concerned that the tightness that we see in the euro area in ex-ante real interest rates is not yet clear on whether is sufficient to bring inflation down to 2%. So, if I were at the ECB or if I were advising the ECB, I would advise the ECB to say, look, this is where we are right now. This is our best estimate right now, but we are prepared to raise interest rates if inflation does not decline, as in our baseline scenario. I wish we had clearer communication along these lines. I hope the Governing Council is more successful in the next few years in restoring price stability than it has been in the last few years.
Thank you, Athanasios. Very clear message to the end for today.